So when we talk about the Übermensch, when we talk about higher and lower, when we talk about the will to power, I think it's very important to keep in mind that what Nietzsche is ultimately concerned with is creativity, with a kind of spiritual life, and not simply a world of power as that phrase might seem. The notion of the will to power itself is problematic. It's a phrase Nietzsche discovered early on, and he really fell in love with it. And we all know how this can work. You fall in love with a phrase and you keep using it, but its meaning keeps changing, and it often carries with it connotations that you really just as soon do away with. To be very particular about this, the notion of the will to power is, in a way, directly borrowed from Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's mentor. But Nietzsche rejects Schopenhauer, and he rejects him rather thoroughly as a pessimist, and he rejects his metaphysics. In particular, the will to power is derived from Schopenhauer's notion of the will, where the will refers to the thing in itself, reality in itself, what's behind all the appearances of the world. But as we saw, Nietzsche rejects that very distinction between appearance and reality, and the idea of a core reality and a reality behind the scenes is something that he utterly rejected. So the notion of will in Schopenhauer is one of the first things to go in his rejection to Schopenhauer, and I would argue that perhaps the will to power should go with it, but it doesn't. Second, the notion of power itself. Power itself is not military power. The word Nietzsche uses here is the word Macht, not Reich. Power is very often the power of thought, the power of the imagination, the power of creativity. There's a sense in which what we're really talking about is not so much power over other people as self-mastery. And Nietzsche, despite his attack on asceticism and slave morality, makes self-mastery one of the centerpieces of his entire philosophy. It applies to the masters also, but there's a sense in which here it is much less desperate. The idea is that masters also master themselves in their pursuit of excellence. But there's a sense in which the discipline of slave morality, which really has allowed us to deny ourselves and, in a way, shape ourselves in ways which we can aspire to. And here, too, we see that tension in Nietzsche between the extent to which we are self-realizing and we are capable of self-mastery, and the extent to which, in some sense, we are the product and the victim of the way we are brought up, our genes, and so on. Schopenhauer took the will to be metaphysical. Nietzsche, of course, rejects metaphysics and rejects that notion of the will to power. I think a better interpretation, although Nietzsche occasionally falls into the idea of talking about the will to power at the basis of everything, but a much better interpretation, and one that fits his theory, I think, in a more sympathetic way, is that the will to power really is a kind of slogan covering a theory of motivation. Here, too, Nietzsche gets ambiguous. There's a sense in which he sometimes thinks about this theory as universal and covering everything, and he sometimes talks about the animal kingdom as well as all human behavior as motivated by the will to power. When he's in his more modest moods, and I think the more reasonable mood, and that is to talk about the will to power as a very particular kind of motivation, one that motivates a great many human behaviors, and leaving aside for a moment the animal kingdom. Basically, the idea is that what motivates us is a drive to feel powerful. And there's an ambiguity here too, because Nietzsche sometimes talks about the will to having power, and sometimes he talks about the importance of the feeling of power. And while we can see how these two might fit together, they're certainly very different. One can be very powerful without knowing it, and one can have the feeling of great power, and the feeling might be an illusion.